Have you ever sent a message you never meant for anyone to read, let alone a stranger? Now imagine, that message reaches one of the most powerful men in the country. A man with everything: status, wealth, influence, yet carrying an emptiness even success couldn't fill. She was a florist, widowed, quiet, just trying to breathe through another lonely morning when she accidentally texted a love letter to the wrong number. He was a CEO, ruthless in boardrooms, but haunted in the quiet of his mind. He could have ignored it, but something in her words made him pause and reply. What happens when two lives so different, so distant collide because of one misplaced message? Would you walk away, or let something unexpected in when the world starts watching, when the past resurfaces, when love becomes a headline? What would you do? This is a story about mistakes that aren't mistakes, about love found in the ruins of grief, and about choosing truth, even when it costs everything. She sends a love letter to the wrong number. The CEO replies and falls madly in love. If this moved you already, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because now it's time to begin the story that no one saw coming, but everyone will feel. The Oregon coast has a way of carrying silence. It's not empty, but wide, quiet, in the kind of way that invites you to sit with your thoughts a little longer than you meant to. Eleanor Carter. Age 47, sat by the kitchen window in her modest clapboard home just outside the town of Yarrow Glen. The sea wasn't visible from here, but she could smell the salt when the wind shifted east. She held a chipped coffee mug in one hand and a folded letter in the other, a letter she had rewritten 3 times that week, and once more, just this morning. It wasn't a love letter, not really. It wasn't a plea or a goodbye either. It was a letting go. At least, that's what she told herself. The handwriting was neat, her words careful but vulnerable. She addressed it to you, because naming him would have made it too real. His name still carried a weight in her chest, even after all these years. Daniel had been her first love, and in some ways, her last. He died 17 years ago, in a car accident just 2 miles from where she now lived. She had been pregnant with their daughter, June, who was now grown and living in Portland. The letter wasn't meant to resurrect ghosts. It was meant to bury one. Eleanor picked up her old flip phone, stubborn in its refusal to die, and typed out the words from her letter, sentence by sentence, thumb by careful thumb. She remembered Daniel's number like a muscle memory, though it had been disconnected since 2008. Still, typing it again was like tracing an old scar. She hesitated before hitting send. Was it silly, maybe? But Eleanor had never been one to chase logic when the heart called louder. She pressed the button, message sent. It was 11:41 p.m. Then, silence. She washed her mug, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Rain tapped gently on the windows as she pulled the blanket up to her chin and stared at the ceiling, wondering if writing the letter had done anything at all. Or maybe it was just one of those things women did to remind themselves they were still capable of feeling, even if no one was there to notice. Across the state line, some 200 miles north in Seattle, a phone buzzed softly on a marble desk. Graham Whitaker had been in the middle of revising a quarterly report when it happened. He glanced at the unknown number and nearly dismissed it. Most late-night messages meant spam, especially for someone like him. A public figure, a CEO, a man many thought they knew because they'd read about his divorces in tabloids or watched his speeches on tech panels. But something about the message preview caught his eye. You probably don't even remember me, but I loved you, quietly, fiercely, and maybe in another life, you would have loved me back. He frowned. The message wasn't meant for him. That much was clear, but still. He read it again, and again. For a man whose life was built around precision, control, and algorithms. The rawness of those words landed like a breath of sea air in a windowless room. His instincts told him to delete it, but something else, something quieter, stopped him. He replied, after a long pause, I don't think this was meant for me, but thank you for writing it anyway. Then he set his phone face down and returned to the report. But his mind wasn't on the numbers anymore. Back in Yarrow Glen. Eleanor's phone buzzed just after midnight. She sat up in bed, blinking against the glow of the screen. Unknown number. She opened the message, heart skipping. I don't think this was meant for me, but thank you for writing it anyway. Her breath caught. She read it twice, then clutched the phone to her chest. Oh no, she whispered. Her fingers trembled as she opened the sent folder. One digit off, a single number, just one wrong key. And now, someone had read her words, a stranger. She considered not responding. She could pretend it never happened. But his reply, it wasn't mocking or cold. It was kind. She typed slowly, with cautious fingers. You're right. It wasn't. But thank you for not laughing. She stared at the message for a full minute before pressing send. And somewhere in a penthouse office that smelled like coffee and midnight stress, Graham Whitaker received her reply and smiled. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of fresh rain and the echo of her own embarrassment. The phone was still on the nightstand, screen dimmed but unread messages waiting. She blinked at it, half hoping the message had vanished. But no, it was still there. The reply from the man who wasn't Daniel, the man who wasn't meant to see her. She got up, wrapped herself in her old flannel robe, and padded into the kitchen. The kettle groaned to life as she stared out the window at her small herb garden, wet with last night's storm. Everything looked ordinary, and yet something had shifted. She picked up the phone and read his reply again. I don't think this was meant for me, but thank you for writing it anyway. She had already responded, brief, honest, thankful. Now, a new message blinked back at her. I couldn't laugh. It was too honest for that. Eleanor sat down slowly. Her heart thudded, not with romance, not yet, with recognition, with the rare feeling of being seen, even just for a moment. She typed, it was never supposed to be read. I just needed to say it out loud, or out text. I guess. The reply came quickly. Sometimes words land where they're meant to, even if the map is wrong. She smiled. That was unexpected. In Seattle, Graham leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He hadn't meant to continue the conversation. He wasn't looking for connection, certainly not with a stranger. But there was something in her voice or her silence between the lines that made him pause. He had spent the last few years speaking in boardrooms and across conference calls, always filtered through ambition, power, image. But this was different. It was just words, honest, human. They messaged again that night, then the night after. The first few exchanges were like passing notes in a crowded classroom, timid, playful. Then came the stories, not all at once, but in slivers. Eleanor told him about the bakery job she worked in her 20s, how she burned her first 100 loaves before mastering sourdough, how her daughter June used to leave sticky notes all over the house with things like, don't forget to breathe and you're doing better than you think. She didn't mention Daniel again, not yet. Graham shared how he once nearly got fired from his own company after missing a launch because he stayed up all night trying to fix a glitch personally, how his best ideas still came during long walks, not meetings, and how, lately, nothing he built felt like it mattered. Their conversations were never long, 15, 20 minutes, sometimes just one message back and forth. But Eleanor found herself checking her phone more often, listening for it. And Graham, well, he was starting to look forward to 11:40 p.m., the way most people looked forward to the weekend. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't a game. It was quiet companionship, the kind that sneaks in without knocking. One night, Eleanor asked, do you ever feel like your life's gotten too loud to hear yourself think? There was a pause. Then, every day. That's why I stopped talking. People only listen when they think they can use what you said. She replied, I'm not here to use you. I don't even know who you are. He wrote, that might be why I finally feel safe saying anything. She stared at those words longer than she meant to. That night, Eleanor dreamt of an unfamiliar man standing in the fog, not calling her name, but waiting as if he already knew hers. The next day, she met with her neighbor, Margaret, for their usual Thursday knitting circle, But Eleanor barely touched her yarn. Her mind wandered. "What's on your mind?" Margaret asked, squinting over her glasses. Eleanor hesitated, then said softly, "Do you believe it's possible to connect with someone you've never met? Like, really connect?" Margaret chuckled. "Honey, I've been married 3 times and still haven't figured out what connection even means. But if it makes you feel more like yourself, maybe it's real." Eleanor nodded, unsure whether that was comfort or a warning. That night, she sent a message without overthinking it. "I'm not sure why I keep texting. Maybe because for once I don't have to pretend to be okay." Graham responded, "Then don't pretend. I'm not here to be impressed, just real." Some people build intimacy through years. Others build it one message at a time, after midnight, under the weight of everything they didn't say out loud during the day. That's what began to form between Eleanor and Graham. Not romance, at least not yet, but something tender, familiar, like old piano keys finally being played again after years of silence. They spoke mostly at night. Eleanor would sit at the kitchen table in her old sweatshirt, sipping chamomile tea, while Graham typed from his office downtown, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, surrounded by quiet hums from machines that never slept. The subjects were ordinary. That's what made them sacred. They talked about the way certain songs could make you stop whatever you were doing and just breathe. About how books left open on bedsides felt like unfinished conversations. How both of them had a habit of talking to themselves in grocery store aisles when no one was around. They didn't exchange last names, no photos, no calls. There was an unspoken rule between them. If the words are enough, maybe we are, too. One night, Eleanor sent, "Today I cried because I broke a plate. Not because of the plate, because of everything I've been holding behind it." Graham didn't reply right away. A full 30 minutes passed. Then, sometimes it's the smallest crack that lets the flood in. "I've been there. Still am." She replied, "Do you think we ever really heal?" He answered, "Maybe not fully, but we grow around the ache. We learn to bloom anyway." That line made Eleanor pause. She reread it 3 times. They didn't message again that night, but she fell asleep with her phone beside her, screen still glowing faintly with his words. Across the city skyline in Seattle, Graham sat in the dark, thinking about how strange it was to feel closer to someone he had never seen than most people he'd known for years. He was a man used to transactions, results, metrics. But Eleanor, she didn't ask for anything, not even his name. She only listened, and in return, he found himself offering pieces of his truth, like breadcrumbs across a forest floor. There were moments when he caught himself typing a message and stopping halfway, not out of fear, but out of reverence, as if some things were too honest to rush. He remembered a night 2 weeks earlier when he had been at a formal gala, surrounded by glass and ambition. Every smile in the room had a price tag. He'd stood there, drink untouched, wondering what it meant to be admired, but never known. That night, he messaged Eleanor, "I don't think anyone really sees me anymore." She replied, "I don't know your face, but I see you, the part of you that types between the lines." And he believed her. On the porch swing outside her house, Eleanor read that message again the following morning. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the wind carried the smell of wet pine and ocean air. She realized something. Graham, whoever he truly was, had become a part of her day, even in his absence. She started noticing things she wanted to tell him. A robin nesting outside her window, a poem scribbled in the margin of a library book, the way she still reached for her late husband's coffee mug every now and then, before remembering. There was comfort in having someone who asked nothing of you, yet still made space for all of you. She sent a message that felt bigger than she expected. "Isn't it strange how words can make you feel close to someone you've never touched?" He replied, "Maybe words are who we really are. Everything else just gets in the way." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full. That weekend, Eleanor attended a town hall meeting about local library funding. She barely said a word, just watched as people bickered over budgets and nostalgia. When she came home, she typed, "I don't think people fight because they stop caring. I think it's because they've forgotten how to be gentle when they do." Graham replied, "That may be the truest thing I've heard all week." Then, after a long pause, "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we met in person?" Eleanor's hands stilled. She didn't expect the question, but a small part of her had thought about it. In moments when she wasn't trying to, she typed, "I'm not sure. Would we still like each other if we did?" He answered, "I think we'd finally exhale." She didn't reply right away, not because she didn't know what to say, but because for the first time in a long while, her heart was louder than her doubts. And it wasn't fear she felt. It was hope. The wind shifted that morning, not in the sky, but in Eleanor's chest. It started with a knock, not loud, not urgent, just persistent. She opened the front door to find no one there, only a small envelope left neatly on the mat. No return address, no handwriting on the outside, just her name printed in cold, precise letters. Inside was a photograph, a grainy image, clearly old, but still unmistakable. It showed her, 20 years younger, marching in a protest outside the courthouse in Eugene, Oregon. Her hair was longer then, her eyes more defiant. Behind her, a broken window and a line of police officers. The edges of the photo were curled like something forgotten in a drawer too long. With the photo came a single note. "You think the world forgets, but not everyone does. No signature, no explanation, just a date. Next Friday." Eleanor sat down hard on the steps, heart pounding. Her fingers tightened around the envelope, creasing the paper. She hadn't thought about that protest in years. It hadn't been violent, not intentionally. She had been there for housing justice, part of a student group trying to raise awareness about predatory evictions. But someone in the crowd broke a window, and in the chaos, Eleanor had been shoved, cuffed, held for hours before being released without charges. The local paper ran a photo of her that week. She had buried the clipping in a box somewhere. She was 23, and now someone had dug it up. She didn't know whether to feel threatened or exposed. That evening, she didn't mention the envelope to Graham. They messaged as usual, shared a few lines about the weather, a book she had picked up at the thrift store, a childhood memory of his involving a piano recital gone terribly wrong. But she felt herself holding back, as if the weight in her chest was too fragile to put into words. Graham sensed it. "You're quiet tonight." "Just tired," she replied, "or just carrying something heavy." Eleanor stared at that message. He always had a way of reaching the core, even when she hadn't said a thing, but she didn't reply. Not yet. Across the state, Graham had his own shadows creeping in. That morning, a news alert popped up on his tablet. Whitaker Technologies faces internal audit after investor pressure. The article speculated on a series of boardroom leaks, employee walkouts, and a rumored data ethics breach, none of it directly tied to Graham, but enough to raise suspicion, enough to make headlines. And headlines, in his world, were currency. He hadn't spoken about it to Eleanor. He didn't want her to see him through that lens. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Still, it weighed on him. In the world he moved through every day, weakness had a scent, and kindness. Kindness could get you swallowed. Yet when her messages arrived, something inside him softened. Not in a performative way, not in a scripted way, but in the quiet exhale of being allowed to just be 2 nights later. Eleanor finally told him, not everything, just enough. "Someone sent me something from my past, something meant to shame me. I'm not sure why." Graham didn't ask what it was, didn't push. He replied, "Everyone has a version of themselves they've buried. The question is, who gets to dig it up, and why?" That made her blink. "You don't want to know what it is. I want you to feel safe enough to tell me. That's different." It was the kind of response that made her eyes sting. But even in that comfort, a whisper of fear lingered. What happens when the past becomes public, when one wrong photo becomes the story that rewrites everything? She didn't have answers, only questions. And a clock ticking toward Friday, on Wednesday. She opened the box in her attic, the one she hadn't touched in over a decade, full of college notebooks, protest flyers, press clippings. There, folded carefully, was the article. "Local student detained after courthouse demonstration turns chaotic." Her name was bold in the headline. She read it slowly, like someone studying a version of herself she barely recognized. She remembered the fear, the anger, but also the fire in her gut. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had believed in something, but the world rarely saw nuance, especially when it came to women like her, women who spoke too loudly, or loved too much, or refused to stay small. That night, she messaged Graham again. Do you think people can be reduced to a single moment? I think people who need to feel superior usually try to do that, because it's easier than looking at the whole. What if the moment is public? Then tell your story before someone else tells it for you. Those words stayed with her long after the screen dimmed. They weren't romantic. They weren't poetic. But they were brave. And sometimes, bravery was the kindest thing someone could offer. The bookstore wasn't much to look at from the outside, tucked between a hardware shop and a closed-down bakery in downtown Portland. Chapters and Dust looked like the kind of place people walked past without noticing. But inside, the air carried a warmth that couldn't be replicated. Wooden floors creaked like old friends, and the smell of paper and coffee blended into something strangely comforting. That's why Eleanor chose it. Not a cafe, not a park, just here. Somewhere quiet enough for words, somewhere safe. She arrived 15 minutes early. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for a paperback on the shelf, an old gardening manual with torn corners. Not that she planned to buy it, it just gave her hands something to do. She wore a long navy coat and her late husband's old wristwatch. She hadn't worn it in years, but something about today made her reach for pieces that anchored her. Her phone buzzed. I'm outside, no pressure. Just wanted to say I'm walking in now. Wait, she put the book down, heart leaping so high she almost laughed. She stood by the window, pretending to browse, eyes scanning the glass door every time it swung open. Then he stepped in, and everything slowed. Graham Whitaker didn't look like a mogul or a name that trended in tech magazines. He wore jeans and a soft charcoal sweater. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed, but not meticulously. His eyes were the first thing she noticed, dark, serious, and searching, as if he was trying to memorize her before he even got close. He saw her instantly. They both stood still for a beat, like the air between them needed permission to move. Then, quietly, he said, "Hi." She smiled. Small but true. Hi. No hugs, no handshakes, just that word, heavy with everything unsaid. They sat in the back, at a small wooden table near the poetry section. Graham ordered tea. Eleanor asked for water but barely touched it. For a while, they talked like strangers. Weather, traffic. The smell of the bookstore. But it wasn't awkward. It was cautious, like peeling layers back, slowly, carefully, to reveal what they already knew but hadn't seen. I expected you to be taller, Eleanor said with a smile, breaking the tension. Graham chuckled. And I expected you to be more nervous. I'm just good at hiding it. Well, he said, you've been good at a lot of things, I think. She tilted her head. Like what? Like making me think I could still feel something real. That landed softly, like snow. They talked for almost 2 hours. She told him about her daughter June, about how she once tried to grow basil and accidentally created a mint jungle on her kitchen windowsill. He told her about the cabin he bought but never visited, about how, when he was younger, he thought success would make him feel safe. They didn't talk about the letter, or the photo, or the envelope. Not yet. But they talked with a kind of honesty that didn't need catching up. Eleanor noticed the way Graham looked at her not with hunger or expectation, but with attention, the rare kind, the kind that listens without waiting for its turn. At one point, their hands accidentally brushed across the table, both pulled back at first, then neither moved. As the bookstore lights dimmed slightly, signaling closing time, Eleanor glanced toward the window. The city had darkened. Rain had begun to tap gently against the glass, soft and rhythmic. I should probably get going, she said, reluctantly. Would it be all right if I walked you to your car? Graham asked. I didn't drive. I took the train. Then I'll walk you to the station. She nodded. Okay. Outside. The street glistened with rain. People passed them, faces lit by phone screens and headlights. But to Eleanor, it all felt far away. They walked in silence for a few blocks. No umbrella, no rush. Just steps that found the same pace. When they reached the station, she turned to him. "I still don't know your last name," she said. He paused. I wasn't sure when the right time was to say it. She smiled gently. "That's okay. You don't have to." He looked at her, as if measuring what it would cost to keep hiding. "Whitaker," he said, finally. "Graham Whitaker." Her eyes flickered, not in shock, just recognition. "I've heard that name before," she said. "In the news. But I didn't know that was you." "Would it have mattered?" he asked. She thought for a long moment. "No, but it makes some things make sense." She leaned in and, with barely there pressure, kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you for showing up," she whispered, and then she disappeared down the stairs, the sound of her steps echoing like a gentle promise. That night, Graham sat in his car longer than he should have. He stared at his hands on the steering wheel, then at the raindrops crawling down the windshield like thoughts refusing to settle. He didn't feel like a CEO or a headline. He just felt like a man who had finally been seen. And that, for now, was enough. The photo appeared 2 days later, a grainy image, clearly taken from across the street, posted quietly on a niche tech blog that typically speculated on executive movements and startup acquisitions. But this time, it wasn't about mergers. It was about a woman no one recognized. Billionaire CEO Graham Whitaker, spotted in Portland bookstore with mystery woman, romance or rebound. The article wasn't malicious, just curious, but in Graham's world, curiosity had consequences. By noon, the photo had already been reposted on social media, then on news aggregators, then on business gossip sites that specialized in sensationalizing the private lives of public people. By midnight, Eleanor's world had changed. She had no idea anything had happened until her phone lit up the next morning with an email from an old coworker. "Is this you with Graham Whitaker? I almost didn't recognize you." Her heart sank. She clicked the link. There it was. Her profile half turned, caught mid-laugh, Graham's face beside hers, warm and unguarded in a way she had never seen captured before. A moment that had felt utterly private, now pinned under headlines. Her hands trembled. She closed the laptop, then reopened it. She read the comments. She shouldn't have. "She looks like someone's school teacher. Definitely not his type. Bet she doesn't even know who he is." Gold digger vibe. Each word was like a stone, not because they were true, but because they were said at all. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Graham sat in a boardroom of glass and leather and rising tension. He had already seen the article. His assistant had sent it with a subject line that read only, "We need to talk." Half the board was quiet, the other half wasn't. "I don't care who you date," said one director, trying to sound reasonable, "but this isn't a good look during an audit." Another chimed in. "You've cultivated an image of discipline and discretion." This, he waved a printout of the article. "Isn't that—" Graham didn't flinch, but inside, something cooled. The temperature of the room, the loyalty of those around him, the way his personal life, once insulated by distance and careful boundaries, had now become part of the corporate narrative. He responded with calm. "This company was built on risk, innovation. If you're concerned about optics, look at our numbers, not my bookstore receipts." They moved on, but he knew what had begun. A shift, not just outside, but inside him, back in Yarrow Glen. Eleanor didn't leave the house all day. She tried to busy herself laundry, sweeping the porch, reorganizing the spice rack, but her thoughts circled the same orbit. What had she expected that no one would notice? That she could walk beside a man like Graham Whitaker and remain invisible. She had wanted her life to stay small, manageable, quiet, and now it was anything but. That night, she sat on her back porch, knees pulled to her chest, phone in hand. She opened their message thread a dozen times before she typed, "This might have been a mistake." A few minutes passed. Then Graham replied, "The bookstore. Or you and me." She stared at the screen, then wrote, "Both. Maybe. I don't know how to be seen like this." Another pause. Then let's not be seen. Let's just be. Her eyes welled up. She didn't know what that meant exactly, but it was enough. For now. The next day, a reporter called her house phone. She didn't answer. Then another one messaged her through Facebook. Then someone she barely knew in high school tagged her in a post. The noise was growing louder. She turned off her phone, but the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loaded. That evening, Graham didn't text. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was standing in front of her house. No warning, no security, no car idling in the street. Just him, holding 2 takeout containers and looking unsure for the first time in years. She opened the door in an old sweatshirt and socks. They looked at each other for a moment. "I brought Chinese," he said, lifting the bags. "Good." She replied, "I forgot how to eat." He stepped inside. They sat at the kitchen table, lit only by a small lamp and the quiet between them. No conversation, no plans. Just 2 people, eating noodles, trying to remember who they were before the world got involved. When dinner was done, Graham looked at her and said, "I can go if you need space." Eleanor shook her head. "You don't scare me," she said softly. "But the world does." He nodded. "I don't blame you." She leaned back in her chair. "I just don't want to become a headline for loving someone." "You won't," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I won't let them write the ending." She met his eyes, then tired, but clear. "I don't need a happy ending," she said. "Just something real." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then let's make it real." The bell above the flower shop door jingled with its usual soft charm, but the woman who walked in did not match the softness of the space. She was tall, striking, dressed in crisp white that clung to her frame like confidence. Large sunglasses hid most of her face, but Eleanor recognized the presence before the identity. It was the kind of presence that didn't ask for permission, just assumed it. "Can I help you?" Eleanor asked, wiping her hands on her apron. The woman removed her sunglasses, slowly. "I'm not here to shop." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. Victoria Dane, fashion mogul, philanthropist, magazine cover regular. The woman once romantically linked to Graham in a dozen articles, though the timelines always shifted. "Then why are you here?" Eleanor asked calmly. "To give you a chance to walk away," Victoria said, placing her sunglasses on the counter. "Before this becomes something you can't survive." Eleanor folded her arms. "From what exactly?" Victoria glanced around the shop with mild disdain, as though taking inventory of everything that made Eleanor less. From him, from his world, from the parts of it that will devour someone like you. And what kind of someone is that, Eleanor asked, voice steady, a woman who doesn't understand what she's stepping into. Victoria stepped closer. "You think this is a love story? It's not. It's a detour, a phase, a pretty little footnote for a man who's lived his life on center stage." Eleanor didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to take anything. I didn't even come here to be found." "Then disappear," Victoria said, her tone low. "Before the headlines find more." There it was, the threat. Not loud, not vulgar, elegant, veiled, and meant to sting. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid of Victoria, but because part of her believed her, the part that still lived small, the part that had learned, after Daniel died, to never expect too much joy at once. The part that whispered, "You don't belong in the middle of someone else's spotlight." She paced the hallway in silence, passing framed photos of June, old family recipes pinned to the fridge, a dried bouquet Graham had brought weeks ago. All of it felt too gentle for the world that had begun knocking. At one point, she stood in front of the mirror and asked aloud, "Who are you trying to become?" The woman in the reflection didn't answer. Meanwhile, Graham found out about Victoria's visit from his assistant. "She's stirring up press again," the assistant said. "2 blog editors called this morning. She's shopping a story about you." And Graham didn't ask what the story was. He already knew how this worked. When people like Victoria stopped being adored, they became architects of their own narratives, even if it meant rewriting someone else's. He left the office early, drove straight to the flower shop. Eleanor was behind the counter, arranging peonies. Her face was composed, but her shoulders told a different story. "I'm sorry," he said, walking in without ceremony. "She's not over you," Eleanor said without turning around. "She's not over being seen." He replied, "And now she's not." Eleanor met his eyes then. She said, "I don't belong in your world." Graham walked closer. "She's wrong." "Is she?" She gestured to the space around her. "Look at this. Graham, I live in a house that leaks when it rains. I still use a microwave from 1998. I work with my hands and fall asleep to podcasts about herbal tea. You fly private. You invest millions before lunch. I don't care," he said gently. "You should." "No," he said more firmly now, "because with you, I feel human again. Like life has color, not just numbers." Eleanor stared at him, walls up but cracking. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I am too," he said. And for the first time, they said it out loud, together. The next day, the headlines came. Old photos, not criminal, not scandalous, but invasive. A picture of Eleanor, younger, louder, standing beside a protest sign during her college days. The caption was cruel in its simplicity. "Whitaker's mystery woman, a past full of trouble." She saw it while sipping her morning coffee. By the time the cup hit the counter, her hands were shaking. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She sat in silence, watching herself be rewritten. Later that night, Graham called. "I have a legal team on it," he said. "The story's coming down. Don't read the comments." "I already did," she said, flatly. He went quiet. She continued. "They're going to keep digging. Graham, you've lived under glass your whole life. I haven't. I made mistakes. I had opinions. Now they'll turn me into something I'm not. You're not what they say, but they'll say it louder than I can." Graham didn't argue, because she was right. That evening, Eleanor sat in the back room of the shop, surrounded by wilting flowers she hadn't watered all day. She thought about disappearing, about erasing every trace of this thing before it turned toxic. But instead, she turned on her voice recorder. She began to speak, not to Graham, not to Victoria, not to the press, to herself, to the girl she once was, to the woman the world hadn't yet met. Eleanor had never posted a video of herself before. She didn't even own a proper tripod. Her phone stood propped between a stack of cookbooks and a potted lavender plant that leaned slightly to the left, as if eavesdropping. There were no filters, no fancy lights, just her, in a gray sweater and the faint hum of a ceiling fan. She looked into the lens, exhaled, and began, "Hi, my name is Eleanor Carter. Some of you know me now because of a photo. Some of you think you know who I am because of a headline, or a past moment taken out of time. So let me tell you who I really am." Her voice didn't shake. It was calm, clear, measured. "I'm 47. I've lived in the same town for over 20 years. I lost my husband in a car accident. I raised a daughter with one hand and held a job with the other. I've been broke. I've been tired. I've been invisible. And I've also been brave. I protested injustice when I was 23, and I'd do it again today. I've spoken too loudly in rooms where I was expected to stay quiet. I've made mistakes, but none that I'm ashamed of, none that define me." She paused. "My life was not built to impress. It was built to endure." She leaned in just slightly. "If that makes me unfit to love or be loved by someone you deem better, maybe the problem isn't me." A silence followed, long, intentional. Then her final words. "To the women watching this, who've been told you don't belong in certain rooms, hearts, or headlines, don't shrink. You are not someone's scandal. You are someone's story. Own it." She reached forward and turned off the camera, and just like that, her voice entered the world. The video was meant for herself, maybe for Graham, maybe for a few people who knew what it felt like to be measured and found wanting by strangers. But by morning, It had over 100,000 views. By lunch, 1 million. Women from across the country flooded the comment section. Mothers, artists, teachers, widows, mechanics, therapists, each one adding pieces of their own stories beneath hers. Eleanor didn't read all the comments, but she read enough to understand one thing. She wasn't alone. Graham watched the video from his office. He didn't blink, didn't answer emails, didn't move until it ended. She never mentioned his name, not once, but somehow every word was about him. Or rather, about why she still chose him even when it would have been easier to walk away. He picked up the phone. "I want the car in 10. He told his driver. Eleanor was sweeping the front of the flower shop when he arrived. She looked up, surprised. "You're supposed to be in meetings," she said. "They can wait," he replied. She leaned the broom against the door and crossed her arms. "So," he smiled. "I just needed to see you. I needed you to know I've never been more proud of anyone in my life." She blinked, emotions caught somewhere between tears and strength. Then she said, "1 night away." He tilted his head. "What? No press, no screens, no speeches. Just us. 1 night away." He smiled. "Anywhere, somewhere quiet." That weekend, they drove to the coast. No assistants, no headlines. Just a 1-story cabin with wood-paneled walls and the smell of salt in the air. They cooked barefoot, danced in the living room with no music, just the rhythm of breathing in sync. That night, under a sky stitched with stars. Eleanor lay with her head on Graham's chest. He ran his fingers through her hair and whispered, "I love you." She didn't reply right away, not because she didn't feel it, but because for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a performance. They felt like peace. When she did speak, it was with her whole chest. "I know." Back in the city, the narrative had changed. Eleanor wasn't a mystery anymore. She was a movement. Articles no longer asked, "Who is she?" but rather, "Why did her voice resonate with so many?" and somewhere in a penthouse office. Victoria Dane scrolled through the headlines, glass of wine in hand, jaw tight. She wasn't finished, and her next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be war. The call came just after 11 a.m. on a Monday that had started like any other. Graham had been reviewing development plans when his legal advisor's voice cut through the line, low and tense. "They're calling a vote." He didn't need to ask which vote. "The board wants a reputation review," the advisor said. "But you and I both know that's a formality. They're trying to force a leadership transition." Graham leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on the skyline. How many votes do they need? Just over half. And with the newest additions, most of them brought in under Victoria's influence. You're on the edge. Silence. Then, they're meeting tomorrow, 11 sharp. When Eleanor opened the door that night, she already knew. His face said it all. Tired, quiet, too quiet. She stepped aside, letting him in. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood in the middle of her small living room, hands in pockets. Not CEO, not public figure, just a man unraveling. "They're coming for my seat," he said finally. She didn't flinch. "Because of me," he shook his head. "Because I stopped playing their game." She walked to him, slow and measured. "Then fight." He blinked at her. "What you heard me. Don't step down. Don't give them a win they didn't earn." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I don't know if I can win." She stepped closer. "Since when do you care about winning more than doing what's right?" Graham looked back at her then, and something in his chest broke open, not with pain, with clarity. The next morning, the boardroom was quiet, not tense, just watching. Graham entered alone. No entourage, no briefcase. Victoria was already seated, dressed in deep crimson, lips sharp, gaze neutral. He didn't greet her, didn't need to. The chairman cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss recent media concerns and whether your public image still aligns with the leadership this company represents." A long pause. Then the doors opened again, and Eleanor walked in. No fanfare. No designer suit. Just a clean blouse, slacks, a file in her hands, and the steady click of boots against hardwood. Heads turned, whispers erupted. She walked straight to the table, placed the file down. I believe the board should see this before any vote is held. Victoria's expression didn't change, but her fingers tapped once on the armrest. Inside the file were printed timelines, data logs, traced communication trails, proof that Victoria Dane had leaked confidential footage, manipulated media outlets, and used personal influence to destabilize public confidence strategies dating back months before Eleanor ever appeared. The room shifted. No one moved. Eleanor looked directly at the chairman. She didn't do this because she cares about this company. She did it because she couldn't stand to lose control over the man who stopped choosing her. Gasps. Real ones. Victoria stood, slow and calm. You think this changes anything? She asked, gaze fixed on Eleanor. You think they'll forget your past? Graham rose beside Eleanor. No, he said, but they'll remember who stood beside her. The board voted, not to remove Graham, to remove Victoria from all influence, effective immediately. Her silence as she gathered her things was louder than any outburst. As she walked past Eleanor, she paused just long enough to whisper, "This isn't over." Eleanor met her eyes, steady. "No, it's just not yours anymore." 2 days later, the headlines changed again. Eleanor Carter, the woman who stood still while the world moved. Graham Whitaker. Thanks, quiet bravery for saving company's integrity. But Eleanor wasn't reading them. She was back at the shop, trimming roses. When Graham walked in, she didn't say a word. He just came to the counter and slid a small paper bag across it, inside her favorite tea, and a note. You once said you didn't need a happy ending. Just something real. So here I am. Real. Every day. As long as you'll let me be. She looked up and smiled. Not like a woman in love. Like a woman who chose love and chose herself. First. A year later. The bookstore was still there. Still creaky. Still cozy. Still untouched by headlines and algorithms. But on one particular afternoon, it had a quiet guest. Eleanor stood by the poetry shelf, one hand tracing the spines of books she'd never read, the other holding a frame. Inside the frame, an old printed text message. I don't think this was meant for me, but thank you for writing it anyway. She smiled to herself. Some things, even when misplaced, find their way. Life with Graham wasn't perfect, but it was honest. He stepped back from day-to-day operations, turned over the CEO role, and focused on mentorship, writing, and a nonprofit he co-founded with Eleanor, an initiative to support women over 40 starting businesses later in life. He moved into her house on the coast. No renovation, no demolition. Just new curtains, stronger plumbing, and a garden that they both learned to tend. He still read spreadsheets in the morning. She still opened the flower shop by 8 sharp. But in between, they had a rhythm. Coffee on the porch, long walks without phones, cooking simple meals and arguing over whose chili recipe was better. His had more heat, hers had more heart. One afternoon, he showed up with 2 plane tickets. Why are you here at 7 a.m.? She asked, still in pajamas. Because we need to go somewhere, he said. Where? He held up the envelope, back to where it started. They flew to a small village Eleanor used to visit with her mother when she was a child. The cottage they stayed in was tiny, no Wi-Fi, a fireplace that smoked, sheets that smelled faintly of lavender and sea salt. They walked the beach barefoot, waves brushing their ankles like memory. That night, Graham built a small fire outside. They sat wrapped in a blanket, stars scattered above them. I never told you something, he said. She turned to him, brow lifted. The night you sent that message, I was going to quit everything. She blinked. What I'd been thinking about leaving the company, disappearing for a while, I felt empty. Like I had built everything except a life that meant anything. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was old, crumpled at the edges. The printed version of her very first message. I couldn't delete it, he said. Something about your words. Reminded me that I still had a heart. Eleanor's eyes filled slowly. I was just screaming into the dark, she whispered. And I was the one who heard you, he said softly. Then he stood, not dramatic, not on one knee, just still, present. He held up a small velvet box, opened it, inside an unflashy, elegant ring, a single sapphire nestled in silver. I don't want more noise. I don't want another empire. I just want you, if you'll have me. She didn't cry. She laughed, then cried, then whispered, "Of course I will." They didn't sell the story to any magazines. They married 6 months later, in the garden behind the flower shop, string lights overhead, wildflowers. Eleanor arranged herself. Graham wore no tie. Eleanor wore daisies in her hair. Guests sat on mismatched chairs. June gave a toast that made everyone cry. And somewhere in the back row, Margaret, the neighbor, said under her breath, "Well, I'll be damned." As the music played and the sun dipped behind the pines, Eleanor looked around the garden. Not everything had healed. Some wounds were still soft. But this was peace. Not the kind you find in silence. The kind you build, slowly, with someone who sees you, and stays. And across the internet, long forgotten by most, the original message still lived. You probably don't even remember me, but I loved you. It had never reached the person it was intended for. But somehow, it found the one it was meant for. Because sometimes, a letter sent to the wrong number isn't wrong at all. It's just a beginning. Sometimes, love doesn't come in grand gestures. Sometimes, it arrives in a quiet message, sent to the wrong number, yet meant for the right soul. Eleanor didn't fit the world's expectations. And Graham, he dared to step out of the world that made him, to choose something real. But behind this love story lies a truth we often forget. Too many hearts are silenced because they don't look the part. Too many lives are judged by headlines, labels, and the lies we tell ourselves about worth. Let this story be more than just a tale. Let it be a reminder that dignity isn't earned by wealth, and love isn't reserved for the privileged. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told you weren't enough, know this: you are not someone's background. You are the story. If this story touched something inside you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We tell stories that speak not just to the mind, but to the heart. And in the next video, we'll bring you another story that reminds us. Even in a world full of noise, human connection is still the loudest truth.